Welcome everybody to the November edition of the JavaScript and Oracle Database Office Hours. My name is Dan McGhan, and I'm a developer advocate here at Oracle. With us today is Blaine Carter, also a developer advocate, and we have Anthony Tuininga as well. Anthony is one of the developers on node-oracledb, so if you have any bugs you'd like to report, feel free to shout them out at him while you're here. So this will be a bit of an Ask Me Anything session. If you have any questions about node-oracledb or JavaScript and Oracle in general, feel free to ask them. Since there's not too many participants today, feel free to turn on audio even, but it may be best to just use the chat feature of Zoom. So just open that up and feel free to ask your questions there. But to get things going, I thought we'd go ahead and take a look at some of the soda stuff that landed in the 3.0 release just recently. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And this is the documentation for node-oracledb. And as usual, this feature has been documented. And if you scroll and scroll, eventually we'll get down here to section 26, which covers the new soda functionality. I should say that these specific APIs for things like collections and documents are documented elsewhere, but this is sort of the higher level doc that you might want to get started to get things rolling. So when you jump down here, some introductory stuff, sort of just talking about soda at a high level. So if you're not yet familiar with SODA, SODA stands for Simple Oracle Document Access. It's basically a set of APIs that allows us to use Oracle Database as a document store. So as opposed to, say, the traditional relational database management system we're used to, we know that Oracle's a multi-model database. We've supported things like spatial and XML, different types of data for a very long time. And JSON and this sort of document store is just yet a new model. These APIs exist now in Node.js. That's what we're going to be talking about today, but they also exist in Python. They exist in Java. They exist for REST. They exist for PL SQL, and of course, the lower level OCI libraries as well. The basic idea is that we get a few new classes in the release. We have at the highest level the SODA database, and we obtain that, I should say, from a connection to the database. And this is really just a means to get at the other APIs, such as getting collections, creating collections, that kind of thing. So we have the collection as well. And a collection you can think of, it's analogous to a table into which you would add normally rows, but with collections we add documents. So we have this class down here. And then the other classes, we have cursor for iterating through sets, result sets, and then we have the SODA operation, which is a means of building up queries, NoSQL style APIs for executing queries. We'll take a look at that today as well.
Yeah, not just queries, by the way, but also write operations for deletes and updates and so forth.
Thank you, sir. By the way, I'm like anybody else that's likely joining the call here today, I'm very new to the SODA APIs and sort of learning them. So luckily we have Anthony here to correct me as we go, as he's been doing all day while I was preparing for this anyway. So in terms of requirements, you're going to need Oracle Database 18.3 or higher, and you're going to need the client libraries 18.3 or higher. It is unlikely that you have these versions of Oracle and the client libraries at this time because they're so new, unless you're doing something very greenfield and you're just spinning up a new database in the cloud. Of course, you would have those then. But one of the best ways, if you're curious and want to kick the tires on this technology, one of the best ways to do that is with our Express edition of the database, which at Open World earlier this month, it was released, or rather last month, I should say. Where are we at? Yeah, last month. It was released, and so that version of Oracle Database XE is 18.4. So that's what I'll be running here today. I'm running a little virtual machine here with XE installed in it, and that's what I'll be using. And of course, welcome you to do the same. The easiest way to get going, just go to Google, Oracle XE. Just take that first link, and you'll find all the information you need here to get started, including download and little videos for installing in Linux, getting connected, all that normal stuff. The latest version of this, by the way, has been greatly improved over what we had with 11G. There's a lot of new features that are just thrown in that maybe weren't included before. And some of the resource limits, such as the number of CPUs, amount of memory, amount of disk space, they've all been increased as well. So it was a great database before, but it's a whole lot better now. And it's free. So a great way to kick the tires on any of the database functionality. So we have this grant that you're going to need as well. So once you've satisfied these requirements, you can move on further down here to the grant. So we have a SOTA app role that you'll need to grant to any user you want to be able to take advantage of this functionality. And Anthony, I think you were saying earlier that this is actually more to do with administrative type operations.
No, not with, not with administrative. So that only works for regular adding documents, updating documents, removing documents, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. You need to have the ability to create tables and sequences and the like if you plan to create collections.
Got it.
Tasks, yeah.
Yeah, I did find that today myself. So I'm going to go ahead and start this from scratch. So I have SQL Developer here. I'm connected to my XE database as the sys user, and I'm going to execute this script. And what I'm doing is starting from scratch. I'm creating a user named soda_demo, and I'm giving that user some quota on the user's table space, and then granting a few privileges here. Obviously, we want the user to be able to connect to the database. Resource does some basic grants like create table, for example, which would be necessary. And then, of course, we have this SOTA app grant, which is required as well. So I will go ahead and run this, and we're starting from scratch. Now I can connect as my SOTA demo user. And as you would expect with a newly created user, we don't have any tables or any objects to speak of at this time. So as I scroll down through the doc, Anthony, if anything's kind of jumping out that's important you want to let folks know about, feel free to do so. Let's start with this, actually. So this is a little bit unique in that the recommendation when working with SOTA specifically.
Scroll up just a couple lines.
Oops.
There we go.
We are.
One more. Yeah, the general recommendation, yeah. Right.
So we have the global Oracle database object, and it has some global properties like auto commit. Generally, when working with the relational side of Oracle database, we recommend you leave the default, which is set to false, and work with your transactions as needed. And then for SOTA, the recommendation is to kind of flip that. Personally, I think it's fine to leave this as the default false, and then just like before with the relational side of things, just handle your transactions as optimally as you can for whatever it is you're doing. All right, so everything, of course, starts with collections, just like would be the case with the relational style things. You need to create tables and then put data into them. So the equivalent of that here is to create a collection. And I have a few documents here that we're going to be working through. So I'll just start here. Everybody able to see us all right, or do I need to blow this up a bit?
Looks good to me.
Okay, good deal. So what I'm doing here is bringing in the Oracle database driver and a configuration file, which just has my really bare necessities to get connected to my new SOTA user that I just created. So I bring those in, and I create a function, an async function called createCollection, and then I invoke it down below. And inside, what I'm doing is getting a connection to the database using that configuration file. Once we have that, we can get the SOTA database by making this call. This is a synchronous call, so no need to put await in front of it. We'll get the SOTA reference. And then we can go ahead and create our collection. In this case, I'm going to call it developers. And it will return the collection by default. If you plan on using it for any reason, you can store that reference and take advantage. I'm actually not using it here. So let me see here. I'm in the terminal, and I'm just going to run node, create collection, and I'm going to go back to SQL Developer and refresh on the tables just so you can see what's actually happening behind the scenes. You don't actually have to know this. It could be thought of as black magic, but I do think it's often helpful and a good thing to know what is happening behind the scenes. So basically, a table is created for us, and you can see the name of the table matches the name I passed in to create collection. Obviously, it's got to store our data, our document somewhere, and that's what this column here is going to be for. This is the JSON document, which is a default. When you do create the collections, there are a lot of ways you can configure the collections. If perhaps you'd rather store binary, arbitrary data, that's possible. You can tweak, for example, how versions or IDs are generated and things of that sort. But when you're getting started, probably best to just stick with the defaults. But you can see that you're going to get, in addition to a single column, you'll get some additional metadata columns that can help you manage what's going into the collection.
Yeah, and those can be manipulated as well. When you call create collection, the second parameter, which isn't shown, is the metadata, or that's one of the options. Yeah. And if you specify that metadata, then you can define which columns are there. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yep.
And so here's an example of how far you could take this if necessary.
Right. The default's usually good for most things, but if you need to address them, you know, something specific, then you got all the options you could possibly want.
Cool, and I believe we can give this a quick test. If I just rerun this, it runs fine without throwing an error. So if you call create collection on a collection that already exists, it essentially acts as a different method call, which is open collection. And the reason for that with these sort of NoSQL style databases, what you can do in your initialization code, in the part of your application that's for starting things up, you can just have a few create collection calls, as many as are necessary. And if they're already there, no problem. And if they're not there, perhaps you're deploying a new version of your application, you needed a couple new collections, and it'll go ahead and create those for you. And they'll be ready then for your application to take advantage of. All right, once you have your collection, of course, you want to start putting some data in. So that moves us over here to add documents. So this time my function takes in a JavaScript object. I'm going to skip down to show you that first. You see I'm declaring a variable, really a constant named developer, and initializing that to a JavaScript object. It has some properties, first name, last name, job, and languages is just an array of strings. And this represents myself, the developer advocate. These are the languages that I'm most comfortable with. And then I invoke that function and pass along that new variable. And so here's the reference to it now. I get, again, a connection to the database, and I just feel like I have to say this. Really, we should be working with connection pools. Keep in mind, we shouldn't be doing one-off connections here. But in any case, we get our connection, and then I can call get soda database again. Once I have that reference, I can open the collection we've previously created, which is developers. And then I can call methods such as insert one and get. So this will insert the JavaScript object and return a soda document. And it'll maybe make a little bit more sense why there's a difference here in a second, but then I just log out that soda document. And again, because I'm not a big fan of that global auto commit setting, I'm going ahead and calling commit here at this point. So we'll go ahead and run add document. And you can see on the left here behind, what went in was just a normal JavaScript object. First name, last name, job, and languages. The document that I logged out that was returned is very different. And you could think of the document really as a wrapper around the content. And so this is your content. And it has some additional metadata. So a lot of this, of course, maps to those columns we saw before. Like the version is essentially a hash of your document, of your content. And then you have the media type, in this case, application JSON. We have the modified and created on values, as well as a primary key that we can use to reference this document. And then there are some methods, such as get content, that would return this content here as a JavaScript object, as well as others that can return them in other formats. Anthony?
Yes, just be aware that when you call insert one and get, the document does not have the content in it. It's assumed that since you pass it in, you don't need to have it returned to you, and that improves performance.
Perfect.
But when you call soda database.create document, then those come into play, get document, or if you fetch them from the database, then those come into play.
Perfect. So other than the fact that I'm logging this one out here, it would be more efficient for me to have just called insert one and not retrieved it back out. Is that right?
Yeah, although often you'll need it for the key and the version potentially.
Right.
So, yeah.
Makes sense. Okay. When I get to number 7, you might call me out again. I'm not too sure I did that one the most efficiently as possible, but we shall see. All right. So it's really that simple to just create a collection and add a document to it. If I go back now to our table and we look at the data, you'll see that there's a new row in here. And if I scroll all the way to the right, get into this blob, and by the way, that's the default is to store this as a blob, could also be a CLOB or even a varchar too. The most performant is going to be as a blob, but of course there's this drawback that you can't actually see the data. Luckily, SQL Dev makes it fairly easy to view it as text, and you can of course see that data that went in as expected. All right, so in part 4 here, what I'm doing, and I'll just skip down again to the data first, is declaring an array to hold the rest of my team. So we've already inserted myself into this collection. Here's Blaine, and Blaine is a much better Python developer than myself, so I've gone ahead and added that to his language set. We also have Chris Saxon on the team. He's really good with both SQL and PL SQL, as is the case for Connor McDonald. And then we have our boss, Stephen Feuerstein, best known really for just PL SQL. So that's the only language he has here. And now I'm invoking the function above called add documents, passing along the developer's array. So what I'm doing here is just getting that collection again, and then iterating over all of the JavaScript objects passed in, calling insert one and get, and just logging that out to the console. So we'll flip over here and run, add more documents, and you can see that we've gone ahead and added 4 more documents. Of course, our table would reflect that as well. So the next thing you might want to do after you've stored some data is, of course, learn then to fetch that data back out. So that's where we start to get into some of these query or SOTA operations. So the way the SOTA operations work, we're basically getting the collection as before, and then we invoke this method find. We're not passing anything into find. Find just returns the SOTA operation. And then there are 2 types of methods. Let me see if I can find the right spot in the documentation for this.
Yeah, terminals and non-terminals.
Right. And so the non-terminals are your means of building up a query, essentially.
Yes.
I'm not really seeing a good...
You're looking at it right now.
I am?
Yep.
There's so many windows in front of me from Zoom. So, okay, right. Here we have the non-terminal methods. Yeah. And then eventually we'll get to the terminal methods. So the non-terminal methods, things like filter or key or limit, these are going to chain. They allow you to chain them. And there's probably some good examples in here. where we're using filter to specify programmatically. This is a NoSQL style API, so you don't need a NoSQL. It'll go ahead and generate that for you behind the scenes. But you're seeing a few more in this case here, where first using filter and then chaining with skip and limit and so on. So it'll build all that up and eventually get to one of these terminal methods, such as getCursor. GetCursor is going to end the building of the operation and then go ahead and execute that for you and return what it is you're asking for based on that terminal method. So what I'm doing here is trying to retrieve a certain key, or rather document by the key. So that's just a single row fetch essentially. And so I pass it in here and then execute get1 to get the soda doc, and I'm logging both the soda doc as well as the content. And the way I've set this up is I'm using process argv to be able to pass some parameters in from the command line. So if we go back to the command line and take a key, such as this key here, and then invoke node, and we're calling the fifth script. And then the last parameter I'll pass in is the key that I want to pull out and execute that. You can see I'm pulling out the record with Stephen in it. So that's a simple single row fetch, but other times you might want to do something a bit more complex. And so we have another example here where I'm using the filter function. And so let's say, for example, this function is called show the front end developers. So without any SQL, I want to be able to query the collection and find any developers that have any of these languages. And so I'm targeting specifically JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, as those are our front-end languages. And I'm using the terminal getCursor, which is somewhat similar to, what's the API call for the relational side?
Get result.
Yeah, it's result set, right. Same basic concept though. So I go into a loop, I pull out using getNext the first record, and then go into a while loop, just logging out the content, and then using getNext to get the next row. So if we run that, I believe I'm on the 6th. You can see that it finds both myself and Blaine because of the folks on our team were the ones that have those front-end skills. So you can see you can do really complex style queries in here. There's several links throughout the documentation that will take you to another doc, such as this sort of intro to soda doc, which is higher level for the database in general. And you can get an idea of the different types of operators that are in here. There's a lot of them, so they'll be able to support all kinds of different operations that you're maybe needing to do in terms of querying your data. But eventually, of course, you'll probably need to make a change to data. So right now, maybe Stephen is only really comfortable with PL SQL, but you know what? He's using Application Express a lot. So he is getting exposure to some of these front-end technologies, and maybe we're to the point we want to add a little HTML under his belt. So that's what I have here. And Anthony, correct me if I've not done this the most efficiently. So basically what I want to do is take that single document for Stephen, and I want to add a new language to his array of languages. And so what I'm doing here is, well, let's see, I have a function called add language, and it takes in the key of the record you want to update and the language you want to add. And so I get the collection, and then I use the key and get1 to get that soda document out, and I log that as it is before. Then I get the content from that so that I can have that in-memory representation. And although the data is stored as JSON, when we call get content, it actually goes ahead and parses that JSON for us. So by the time we get it over here, it's in-memory representation, JavaScript representation. So I can just use content.languages. That's an array. An array, of course, has the push method. I can add the language that was passed in. And then I'm using, again, I'm going back to that collection, using the key and calling replace one and get and sending that content back in. Did I get this right?
Yep,
Anthony?
looks good.
All right. And then I log that out afterwards. So from the command line, what I'm doing here is I'm passing the 2 arguments and the key as well as the language. So if I grab Stephen's key again, which was this key here, and I invoke this script, paste in that key and the language we want to add, such as HTML, run that, you can see the before and the after in terms of the versions are different. This is the hash. You can see it's clearly different. And now if I rerun that query from before for the front-end devs, we now get Stephen Feuerstein as well, because of course he's got HTML in there, finally. All right, well, that's it in a nutshell for me. I think this is sort of, at least for folks getting started, like the most basic kind of bare bones type of example. Does anybody have any questions about this or any other SOTA style APIs or functionality? Or have any other questions at all? Feel free to just put them in the chat. Anthony, what am I missing here in terms of important stuff folks need to know when using this technology?
I think you covered it, everything except deletes. But delete is simply a matter of calling remove instead of replace. So pretty straightforward.
There was some doc that mentioned I shouldn't be dropping the table, or dropping the table, right? I'm supposed to use the APIs, right? Why is that?
It's not what they call a first-class object. So that means the database doesn't really understand when you say drop this table that it's a SOTA document table. So you have to use the SOTA API.
So there must be some other metadata elsewhere that would get out of sync if I were to do that?
There is, yeah.
And so what I was doing earlier here, where I'm just sort of dropping the user and then recreating the user, is that bad too?
No, that one's fine.
Okay, good deal. All right. Blaine, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Just curious, have you used any of this stuff with Python yet?
Almost.
Almost. I'll ask you
No,
again.
I've been focusing a lot on some of the IoT aspects of weird projects.
Well, that's an interesting use case. I would actually think would be a really good, almost perfect fit, really, for these SOTA style APIs, where you're working with some IoT device. It's probably taking a step back, we ought to talk maybe a little bit about use cases. And so this is one of those use cases where you're working with a device, let's say, that's maybe recording temperature or watts or whatever it may be, whatever your IoT device is, and it's sending you some data that you want to store. And you could create a table, right? Traditional table with certain types of columns and data types. But that IoT device may get an update and all of a sudden start sending you something different, right? And you may then need to change your table definition to be able to account for the new data coming in, right? Whereas these SOTA style APIs, they don't have a schema, just a collection. So you could just keep storing the data. Of course, you might be getting different types of data, schema on read type issues, but it's nice just recording, not having to worry about it. Sometimes.
It'd probably be a good fit for one of the projects I've been thinking about trying lately. It's an email archiving project. It's written in Python. It's an open source project, but email is a perfect example of random fields that needing some flexibility.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll try it when I get into that.
Anybody have any other use cases? I'm thinking basically any time, and you don't run into these situations a lot, but you do run into them. Any time where the relational model is simply not a good fit. And I've run into it several times. Aside from perhaps the IoT side, you may be collecting data from a third-party API, such as Twitter or Facebook, and you want to store information, maybe the tweets about your company, and then do sentiment analysis on those to figure out if people are happy with what you're doing or not. And again, you're working with a third-party API. They're probably returning some kind of JSON or something, and you don't know what they're going to return. They could change that JSON at any point in the future, and you don't want to have to change your schema to account for those changes. Just sticking in what they give you is great. And there's other cases such as have you ever run into the entity attribute value model before?
Nope.
No? This is something that usually tends to happen in the medical field, where you have scientists that are doing a lot of research, and they basically are building out the schema. And so what tends to happen is they need this ability, but they often don't have the correct kind of grants to build out a schema. And so you often give people 3 different tables, and essentially the rows are defining the schema and the types of data. It's a horrible model. It's certainly not what databases are good at. So querying that data back out can be difficult, whereas this style API can simplify that, right? They can define and migrate that schema at any point without any issues.
Yeah, and that reminds me of what you had said earlier today too about rapid prototyping is another possible reason for using Soda, because you don't know what the schema is going to look like yet. So
yep, that's a really good one. Yeah, so you're starting to build out a new application. And I think, at least for myself anyway, I've always started at the database and kind of worked my way forward into the app. And I think things have kind of really turned around on that one. These days, people want to see the app. They want to see it, touch it, feel it sooner rather than later, change it if necessary, that kind of thing. And so with Soda, it's terribly easy to just create a collection and create another collection, just start stuffing data in, get your GUI up there, and maybe later down the road, when things have stabilized some, you can then decide if this is really better for a relational model, and then just sort of swap that out in the back end once you know what things look like. Good point. Thanks for that one.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, we've gone a little over our normal time, so unless there are any other questions, and I don't see any in the queue, I think we'll go ahead and end it here. Just thank everybody for showing up, and hope to see you again in about another month. By the way, if you have any questions, you can ask them in the AskTOM app, and we can review those before we start the mission or the session. And if you have any topics you'd like us to cover in the future, feel free to ask, and we can certainly consider them. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.
See you guys.